Guys, let's talk about death. Death is a subject that we never talk about. We try our best not to think about it. In our culture, we try to shove it as far away as possible. We try to delay it as long as possible. We try to pretend it doesn't exist. We try to minimize all risk, which is, as we've learned over the past year of coronavirus, a fool's errand. Risk exists everywhere, and anytime you try to mitigate it in one area, you incur it in another area. A classic example of this was when they pulled the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because it caused blood clots in a very, very few women. If you think about that for 1 second, right, you shut down the whole world because coronavirus is the risk to end all risks. But then you shut down a vaccine which prevents coronavirus because it causes risks, right? It's like the thing that is just in front of our attention right now that causes risks is the thing that we freak out about without acknowledging that risk is everywhere. Death is everywhere. People die. 100% of humans die. The death rate of humanity is 100%. And smart cultures, sophisticated cultures, wise cultures have rituals and wisdom associated with acknowledging death. It's not just a Christian thing. It's all the major faiths, all the Abrahamic faiths, all of the pagan traditions have some way of grappling with the fact that our lives end. And we have, and when I say we don't talk about death, I mean we do talk about death on this show. But it's something that as a society we've become incredibly averse to dealing with. And so today's episode is all about that. And I am joined in this noble endeavor by an honorary heretic. So before we jump into it, let me just bring you a word from the Ancient Language Institute. I love these guys, and you can start learning Latin or Ancient Greek with them this summer. I talk all the time about how great it is to learn ancient languages. They are meant to be read and understood. If you get them taught badly, then you have to, slog your way through memorization and difficult grammar drills and vocab lists. But with ALI, what they do is they focus on developing reading skills as soon as possible. So you can work with them to read people like Virgil, Aristotle, even the New Testament, which is pretty cool, in Greek with just a few semesters of study. If you go to ancientlanguage.com/Young Heretics, you can get started and you can get 15% off with the code HERETICS, HERETICS, just like in the title. And these summer semester signups are only open for another couple of weeks. So go ahead and check them out. They do fill up really quickly. They filled up really quickly last time. If you reach out to them, they will get a personal consultation and place you in the ideal class. One more time, it's ancientlanguage.com/Young Heretics, ancientlanguage.com/Young Heretics with the offer code HERETICS for 15% off. Okay, now, you may have heard of Sohrab Ahmari. He's a big name, and it's awesome to be joined by him today. It's probable that you know of him in his role as a journalist and a commentator on political issues. He's the op-ed editor of the New York Post. He contributes to First Things. Those of you who follow sort of conservative Twitter may remember that Amari's op-ed against David French was a really big deal recently, but he's known for much more than that. His writing on theology, on politics. And this book, which he has just published, which is called The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, is actually not hyper-political, except in the way that this show touches on politics sometimes. If you like this show, this is a really good book for you because it's really about the deep traditions of the West. And today we're going to pick out the chapter that talks about death and just get into it with Sorab a little bit and have a chat with him. But in the lead up to it, I just want to sort of frame this a little bit, talk about what this book is about, talk about the issues it raises, and what we'll be discussing with Sohrab Ahmari. So the book is written as kind of a letter, an extended letter to Amari's son, Maximilian, or Max. And I just want to read one portion from the preface that kind of I thought really spoke to me and expresses the worries of a religious father, that Amari is a Catholic, for raising children in this sort of degraded age. Amari writes, "My bad dream runs something like this. Max returns home after finishing college at some elite university. He plans to spend 2 weeks with his parents before striking out on his own as a junior associate at an investment bank or hedge fund or publishing house or advertising agency. It doesn't really matter which meritocratic colony he chooses. 2 decades of good nutrition, proper schooling, and rich extracurricular activities have yielded a winsome, well-rounded young man. Max has clear skin, an easy smile, and the confidence that comes with knowing life's material fruits are ripe for his picking. One night, Max's friends stop by for dinner. One is a Southern Congresswoman's glad-handing son, bound for Yale Law School. Another has just secured seed funding for a tech startup she launched as an undergrad. Still another, an environmental engineering graduate, has won a Sustainable Design Award and been named an emerging visionary by a prestigious foundation in Davos, Switzerland. At this dinner, Max's mother and I take an obvious pleasure in our son. In him, we see our own love embodied and projected into the future. And let's be honest, the fact that this is the company he keeps reassures us that we have minimally succeeded as parents. Max looks set to be a winner in life. Yet, the moment he and his friends open their mouths to speak, they talk mostly about money. They boast about entry-level salaries at their dream firms, how long it will take them to make partner, the Fifth Avenue apartments owned by senior associates not much older than they are, and so on. They might be well-read, but to the extent they discuss ideas at all, they concern themselves with the latest TED Talk about the power of making eye contact in meetings, or the power of genetically personalized steroids to push your workout to the next level. Max pays a certain obeisance to his father's ancient faith. Sure, he tells me, he heard the Mass at the college chaplaincy when he wasn't too busy. But if I push past this polite condescension to his father's sensibilities, he admits that while the Catholic faith might have some social utility, he doesn't think it should be taken, quote, too seriously, end quote. So Amari is articulating here, I think, a concern that's on a lot of parents' minds, that the world today, the world of 2021, or the world of the 21st century, doesn't claim souls by, extravagantly degrading them. It claims them by sort of neutering them, by dulling their sensibilities, by giving them all of these technological comforts and pleasures, and yet sort of dimming the lights on their truly spiritual, that is, their religious sensibilities, their engagement with the wisdom of tradition, and so forth. And so he writes this essentially as a prophylactic against that nightmare scenario of a kind of hyper-comfortable, just a surrender to the world on Max's part. And the ultimate version of that, right? Remember I talked at the beginning of this episode about postponing death indefinitely, which is what the world, the technological world, the technocratic world sort of falsely promises that we can do. That's the ultimate version of this comfort, this idea that we can wish away death, that we can hedge it away, or just imagine ourselves to be free of death, able to move past death. And that's chapter 12, which is what we're going to be talking about. And each one of these chapters is dedicated to a particular individual that Amari feels sort of exemplifies a certain kind of wisdom or a certain set of ideas. They're not all Christians. In fact, the one that we're talking about is not a Christian, but a Roman Stoic, Seneca the Younger. So I'll read just a little portion of Sorab's treatment of Seneca's life before we read some of Seneca himself on this topic of death, right? How do we prepare for death? How do we understand death? Now, Seneca the Younger lived and, in fact, was involved in government during the time of the Emperor Nero, who is famous for his cruelty. We've talked about him before, known as this despotic tyrant, known for having condemned many Christians to death, in part, perhaps, because he blamed them. He was trying to scapegoat them for the fire, which is also a famous part of his reign. But the funny part, and Sorab gets into this, is that, before he really took an active hand in government, Nero was kind of a distant emperor. And so Seneca was able, along with a number of other administrators, to help Rome reach a period of sort of remarkable peace and prosperity. So Sorab talks about the Great Fire and its aftermath, and then about Nero's sort of self-assertion, his maniacal self-assertion in government. And he says, most tragic of all, for Romans who cared about good government in the philosophical life, the exposure of the conspiracy, that is a conspiracy to take Nero's life, gave Nero the excuse he had been looking for to destroy his erstwhile tutor and chief advisor. This man was a friend of L. Calpurnius Piso. We've talked about him before, a sort of noble statesman, and the uncle of the poet Lucan, also involved in the conspiracy. He may have been aware of the operation and surely would have cheered it if it were successful, but the historian's consensus is that he almost certainly wasn't actively involved. Nevertheless, Nero sentenced him to death. This man had spent his whole life thinking and writing about death and preparing to meet his own end. He taught his friends and the whole Roman world to live each day as if it could be the last, and in this way to make peace with mortality. Now fate had brought him what it rarely grants philosophers, a chance to practice what they preach. He was known as Seneca the Younger, or more simply, Seneca. Now, we're going to talk with Sorab about how Seneca died, what he taught about death. But just to whet our appetites as we go into this interview, I will read one portion of a letter. So much of what we read by Seneca are these, they're called the Epistulae Morales, the moral letters to his friend Lucilius. And they are remarkable, they're sort of, they inaugurate in some ways a genre of the kind of letter as essay. And so they contain extensive reflections on the world, on philosophy, on Stoicism, which we've talked about a lot on this show, right? And so I'll read one among a number of them that, I mean, Sorab quotes more, but I'll read one that I think is pertinent to what I've been talking about with coronavirus and everything. So this is the Penguin Classics edition. It's called Letters from a Stoic, translated by Robin Campbell. The selected letters from these moral epistles. And this one is 91. It's about the fire which destroyed the ancient version of the French city of Lyon. It was in what was then called Gaul. And Seneca writes, "Nothing is durable, whether for an individual or for a society. The destinies of men and cities alike sweep onwards. Terror strikes amid the most tranquil surroundings, and without any disturbance in the background to give rise to them, calamities spring from the least expected quarter. States which stood firm through civil war as well as wars external collapse without a hand being raised against them. How few nations have made of their prosperity a lasting thing. This is why we need to envisage every possibility and to strengthen the spirit, to deal with the things which may conceivably come about. Rehearse them in your mind. Exile, torture, war, shipwreck. Misfortune may snatch you away from your country, or your country away from you, may banish you into some wilderness. These very surroundings in which the masses suffocate may become a wilderness. All the terms of our human lot should be before our eyes. We should be anticipating not merely all that commonly happens, but all that is conceivably capable of happening. If we do not want to be overwhelmed and struck numb by rare events as if they were unprecedented ones, fortune needs envisaging in a thoroughly comprehensive way." Now, this is it may strike us as a somewhat morbid way of going about things. And I don't think that Seneca was saying that we should always be weeping and wailing, just the opposite, right? He wanted us to have a real felt sense of the impermanence of life. And I've said this before, that, if we view the past year and the coronavirus and all of these catastrophes, pandemic and lockdown and despotism, right? If we view these things as exceptions to the human rule, then we didn't know how good we had it before. Because in fact, the real exception is the American prosperity that we enjoyed for so much of the 20th century, right? And this kind of prominence in the world, this winning lottery ticket that we drew if we were born in this country, or if, the wonderful gift that we were given if we gained citizenship, whatever. The reality of human life is as Seneca describes it. And he describes the way that this fire just blitzed Lyon instantaneously. It was like it was there and then it was gone. And he says this is an object lesson in understanding not just that death can sweep us away, but that misfortune is always there, and we are never actually secure in the way that we fondly imagine ourselves to be. And so in order to avoid this sense of shock and disappointment that comes when something like coronavirus happens, one of the daily practices that we can adopt is actually reckoning in our hearts daily with the fact that you don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes. There's that wonderful parable in Luke about the Gospel of Luke, about the man who, gathers things into granaries, and then he says to his soul, "You have everything you need now to be happy." as if he's trying to convince himself. But then, of course, this voice comes from heaven and says, this very day, your life will be required of you. So living with that in mind is actually counterintuitively is a path to a lot more serenity and a lot more sort of self-composure than if we just try to imagine that we can avoid death forever, that we can wish death away and all sorts of things. We're going to get into these issues, more of this stuff with Sorab himself. Okay, so last week I introduced you guys to this awesome company, my pals at the Classic Learning Test, or CLT. This is a standardized test that is basically sticking it to the College Board, which has gone full woke. The College Board are the company that runs the PSAT, the SAT, and that determines what gets taught in schools, because you have to teach to the test, essentially. That makes them the most influential company in American education, and they're toxic. They are doing things like, creating an adversity score for students to quantify, how much suffering they've been through. This is beyond the beyond, and there has to be a competitor to this, and that is what the Classic Learning Test is. It is accepted by more than 200 colleges. It's the preferred test for some of the best ones, Thomas Aquinas, Grove City, Hillsdale, right? The next test date is June 19th. So when you register, you use the offer code HERETICS, HERETICS. You get 20% off the registration fee at cltexam.com. They have an awesome podcast, Anchored Podcast. They've had great guests, Dr. Robbie P. George, Cornel West, yours truly. So go check that out. That's the Anchored Podcast. Go to cltexam.com for 20% off your registration fee when you use the offer code HERETICS. All right. It's an exciting day because we have another honorary heretic. This is always a big moment when we induct somebody into the Heretic Hall of Fame. I always feel a little bit awkward introducing people this way, and especially, Sorab, I feel awkward introducing you this way, since I know you are a devout and faithful Catholic. I do not mean to accuse you of heresy in that regard, but this show is all about heresy from the woke doctrines of the Academy. And in that sense, I think you're very much part of the gang. So welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Spencer.
Let's talk a little bit about this new book. It's called The Unbroken Thread. And I think there's an aspect of it that people who watch this show will be particularly interested in. And that's, I get a lot of questions about how to introduce children into the great traditions of the West. It's something, obviously, some of these books that we talk about, that you write about in your book, can be kind of big and scary, and there's, they deal with some pretty intense themes. But this is a book that you've addressed to your son, who's 2 years old. Is that right? Maximilian's 2?
He was 2 when I started writing it. He's now almost 4.
Oh, wow. Okay. Got it. So it's been a process, but tell us a little bit about the concept of this book and why you chose to frame it in this way, why you're writing to your son.
Yeah, sure. I have to be slightly autobiographical, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. So I was born and raised in Iran, and I immigrated to the United States when I was 13. And when I immigrated to the United States, I saw America as this land of possibility, precisely in the sense that it meant being able to sever yourself from tradition, which to my mind, tradition meant, my inheritance in Iran, and specifically the Islamic Republic, this repressive regime. And so I, in a way, reveled in the anti-traditional streak in American culture, which, allows every person to define himself or herself on her own. That is our absolute liberty, and being able to enjoy kind of maximal individual autonomy, not to be bound by the dead hand of tradition, as it were. That's not all of American culture, but it's one streak in American culture.
Right, and you were watching us from afar in the 90s, right? Which was maybe a high point of this ethos. I think people were really kind of just delighted in that sort of liberation at this point.
Yes, I mean it's gone on. It's on hyperdrive now, but already then, you watched like the opening credits of Baywatch and you're a teenage boy. No black-clad clerical authority can really compete after that. So I reveled in it until I became a father myself. I became a father and a Christian in the same age. I was 31 years old. I was living in London at the time, and the story of why I became a Christian is an entirely separate story, but I won't go into it, other than the sense that, now I have a son. My wife is Chinese born, I'm Iranian born. And I suddenly began to think of the inheritance of what I would pass on, literally tradition, traditio, to my own son, who, his name is Maximilian. And I began, first of all, by that choice of name. So, as I framed the book in the introduction, I called my son Maximilian Kolbe because, as you know, Roman Catholics name their children after saints. It wins them the patronage of the saint in heaven. But in my case, I also picked Maximilian Kolbe because I wanted to tie my son to his story, the saint's story, and also what that story represented in terms of my own understanding of what is the best in the West, or really in Christendom, and the whole kind of classical and Christian tradition that is our inheritance, our true inheritance in this society. So Maximilian Kolbe was a Franciscan friar who, lived an adventurous life in many ways, but at the end of his life, he was arrested by the Nazis. He's in Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1941, and someone escapes from his prison block. So the Nazis, typically the response to that was that they would pick 10 men from that block and randomly choose them to starve to death. And Maximilian Kolbe was not picked as one of the 10. Nevertheless, when he heard one of the men who were picked say, "My wife, my children," Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward in the line and said, "I will take his place in the punishment bunker," because he has a wife and children. And so, obviously, the Christian idea of sacrifice, of embracing the cross, and finding freedom precisely in relinquishing yourself, in this case, relinquishing or limiting yourself to the point of death. He exemplified that, and he was recognized as a saint by the church in 1982. So I named my son after Maximilian Kolbe because I wanted to bound him to the ideals that this man represented, kind of the summit of Christian life and the ideals behind that. So I did that, but my question was, is that enough? Just naming your kid. How do I begin to form a young person in an intelligible way, in a way that respects his true freedom, so that he doesn't just fall into kind of the normal pattern of life among elites, upper middle class, and upper class people in our society. So I have this kind of nightmare, which I play out in the book at the beginning, where I tell the story of Maximilian Kolbe, and then I imagine my own son, my Maximilian, growing up. He's successful by material terms. I imagine him, graduating from some elite college, but he comes home and all he can talk about is money. All he can talk about is kind of the shallow ideas of our exceedingly shallow age. So it's not like I imagine him becoming, I don't know, an opioid addict. God forbid it could, but that's not my kind of fear. My fear is that he'll just be a kind of complacent and live an unexamined life. So how do I inoculate him against those tendencies of our society, or let's say the deformations of the contemporary West? So I said, I can't just preach to him bang 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 on a drum. That doesn't work. So I will pose 12 questions that touch on kind of every dimension of life, but roughly speaking, about half have to do with religion and half to do with our good in this life, the temporal good, and explore each through the life of one great thinker. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm just a journalist and a storyteller. So I make no claim to originality in this book. All I'm trying to do is transmit some of the best of this kind of dissident tradition. It's become a dissident tradition. It really was. It used to be the bedrock tradition of the West, to him. And so I wrote the book, and I thought that by posing questions instead of just pronouncing certainties, and then by exploring each question through the life of a great thinker, I would be more effective, in a sense, as just to kind of raise questions in my son's mind, and hopefully the reader's mind, that our kind of contemporary certainties, that, for example, the individual autonomy is the highest good, or the idea that the avoidance of death is just absolutely paramount in every sense, that there has been another kind of stream of thought in the West that stands in contradiction to that, and it needs to get a fair hearing. So that's how the book was born.
One of the works that we've spent quite a bit of time on this show is C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And there's just a sort of offhanded comment in that a series of speeches, really, in which he says that when a father teaches his son the traditions of his moral culture, his upbringing, he's giving the best of his soul to humanize him, just as he gave of his body to create him. And I think that's it's very much your project here in this book. There's not really a higher project that I can think of, and an advantage of your approach, I think, is that it's not condescending at all. It's very high-minded, actually, but it's really legible. This book, I mean, it's come out in a very, I think, readable and accessible way, and it does deal, as you say, that a major theme throughout is what I would think of as sort of a paradox of freedom. That we have this idea about freedom as kind of 360-degree choice. You just wherever you go, you have no limits. And in fact, as you say, the more bound we are to a set of traditions, to to the realities of the world, and to the obligations that we have as moral agents, the freer we are to make the kinds of choices that Kolbe makes, even though they're really they seem insurmountable and astonishing. I want to talk specifically with you about your chapter on Seneca and death. Because as you suggested, right, death is one of the things that in our culture we have a set of assumptions about, usually pretty unexamined. And we've talked about this a lot with coronavirus, for example, the idea that the avoidance of death and just the resistance of the reality of it is somehow the highest good. Can you talk a little bit about how, both Seneca's life really and Kolbe's life lead us to a pretty serious reconsideration of that? Tell us just a little bit about your thinking there and what you'd most like Max to get out of your teaching on death.
Yeah, sure. So briefly on Seneca, he was born in 4 BC in Cordoba, Spain, in Roman Spain, and pretty soon after that he moved with his father to Rome, so his father could be a teacher of rhetoric. And when he was a teenager, he became interested in Stoic philosophy. And obviously, there are many schools of Stoicism. His took the kind of basic assumptions that that true freedom lies in mastery of your passions, and in contemplation of the logos of the ordered reality around you. And if you could achieve that, you have this kind of unflappable sense of calm in the face of life's turbulence. What was unique about Seneca, maybe not unique, but remarkable about Seneca, was that although he was a Stoic, he was also a very ambitious man. And so he rose to become a senator under the Emperor Caligula. And then eventually he became one of 2 chief advisors to the young Nero. And which, by the way, I mean, interesting side note that Nero is often to our day, his very name is a kind of byword or synonym for misrule. But actually, the first 5 years or so of Nero's reign are considered some of the best governed in Rome's imperial history, and that's because of Seneca in large part, because he was very much concerned with the common good. And the emperor himself,
Nero was sort of distracted, right? I mean,
right, he was so dissolute. He was going around, robbing common citizens or whatever, that he could leave governance in the hands of Seneca, who also wrote his maiden Senate speech. So that's his life, and we can get to his death, which is kind of interesting because one of the things that Seneca obsessed in a healthy way, was how to come to terms with death. So a large chunk of his writings, which have come down to us in the form of these moral epistles that he wrote to his friends, to his own family members, concern the fear of death and why the right way to approach death. And this is as a pagan, right? He's a pagan Stoic. He doesn't have Christianity or a vision of eternal life, but just in this world to try to live, not in a jackass foolhardy way to think, well, just let it come, I'll do anything stupid because there's no fearing death, but to have a kind of, to put death in its right perspective and be able to come to terms with it as a force that humanizes us, as a force that disciplines us, and ultimately helps us live better if we, as he said, basically kind of daily meditate on your own death, and you'll live better that day.
Right. A while back, we read Marcus Aurelius on this show. We've spent a fair bit of time talking about Greek Stoicism as well and the sort of early, Stoicism of Zeno. Um, but the fascinating thing about Seneca, and you portray him this way, is his, as you say, his worldliness at the same time as he was kind of meditating always on the sort of end of life, and especially in the context of what you say about your son. Your true nightmare is that he will just be essentially absorbed into the world and into secular culture and not have any sort of sense of what's beyond it. I think often about Augustine at the end of the Confessions, who says about food and drink that it's not like sex, which he could sort of give up, but that you have to have this constant exposure to temptation, that your creaturely body just needs food, and so you have to kind of constantly tempt yourself to overindulge. And I think of that with Seneca as well, just this this desire to be, we would say, Christians would say, in the world, but not of the world. How is it, do you think, that he managed that? I mean, it's a real balancing act, especially with death, which is kind of the ultimate thing that people seem to want to avoid.
So, just a side note, since you mentioned St. Augustine, that you reminded me of the Church Fathers, that Seneca is the one pagan writer about whom the entire patristic tradition is more or less positive. In other words, the Church Fathers, for the most part, did not write negatively of Seneca the Younger. And I think there's something to that obviously he didn't have the benefit of revelation, but that his way of thinking about how to be in the world and some of his ethic aligns with Christianity, although there are limits too. I mean, he thought he would have supported euthanasia, obviously, whereas the church would support, euthanizing yourself.
But they were a stern bunch, the Church Fathers. So it's to make it past their censorship,
their scrutiny,
or censure rather.
But Seneca taught. He when he was a young Stoic and he was kind of immersing himself, he definitely practiced all the austerities of the Stoic. Over time, I get the impression, and I think his kind of consensus biography, that he kind of eased up on the absolute austerity of the Stoic life, but not all of it. So he famously said, he wouldn't eat mushrooms and oysters, which are kind of luxurious food in the Roman world, because he said they were condiments, not real food, and you don't need that. He said, the best odor of the body is absence of odor, so he of any kind of unnatural odor, so he wouldn't use any fragrance. I'm not sure if I would want to sign on to that one.
Yeah, that's a tall ask, but yeah. So these remnants of austerity that he kind of kept with him even as he went. Yeah.
But I think, to get to your question, the ultimate lesson I take away for my son out of Seneca is this idea that the worldly pleasures, including food, at some point should get boring to you. It doesn't mean you don't try them out or whatever, but to be kind of the opposite and just kind of be like a lot of young people are today, these kind of omnivorous epicures that are just constantly out for searching for like the latest kind of restaurants, although bracket that the fact that restaurants are suffering very much in New York right now. But before the coronavirus, there was that kind of foodie scene. And he would say, and he's written that, look, at some point, the taste of these things will get boring to you. And it doesn't matter how much wine passes through your bladder, at some point you've tried it all. And that, a life in which you seek to constantly prolong these types of experiences is like a story that doesn't have an ending. Any good story has a kind of beginning, middle, and end, and a lot of movies that don't, I find insufferable for that reason, or a lot of novels that aren't strictly plot driven. And I think Seneca would agree with that, in terms of your own life should be a sort of a story that has an end, and that all those pleasures, but also the more kind of noble goods like self-sacrifice of a Colby, all the things that we value in honorable people and noble people, find their meaning in relation to an endpoint of death. And that if death weren't there, everything just kind of drags on and becomes a kind of boring story. And as a Christian, obviously, I have faith in eternal life in a way that that Seneca didn't. He just thought we sort of dissolve into the logos, and that's the end of it. Nevertheless, I'm very careful in the chapter to distinguish, I think, between the Christian promise of eternal life, where you get to, you know, hopefully, uh, contemplate the Lord's, beauty and goodness forever, and precisely because He is infinite, you can do that from infinity. That promise of eternal life from the promise of a kind of biological replacement for it, where you seek to extend life or seek to extend the enjoyment of those things in life that we all like, even to the point of artificially doing it, right? Which is something that scientists are attempting to do with, rewiring the genetic clock in your cells, or
Sure.
diets and so forth that are beginning to show promise. Cocktails of drugs that show that you can slow down aging. I think Seneca would just find that absolutely horrible, and he saw a version of it in his own kind of pre-scientific age, where people just kept trying to keep on holding on to present earthly life in an unhealthy way that ultimately rendered the good things in life meaningless too.
Right. No, this is, I think, one of the features of the chapter that I found most interesting. And I want to ask you about it. You know, when you mention this sort of Epicureanism that a lot of young people basically just are Epicureans by default, that's something I'm very sympathetic to. We've talked about that a lot on this show. And my friend Richard Samuelson, who's a scholar of John Adams' work and thought, emailed me after I did an episode on Epicurus to note that Adams in the early 1800s had written already to a friend that basically all of modern philosophy was Epicureanism, and we've become these sort of just pleasure seekers. So I certainly think that is apparent to anyone with eyes to see. And it does seem plain, right, that these life extension technologies, or even just our mentality of life extension, right, turns us into these sort of scared creatures whose lives ultimately might be long, but they're hardly worth living. Uh, on the other hand, right, a skeptic will hear us talking about this and say, well, hold up. I mean, life before cancer medications, life before penicillin, life before any number of life extending technologies was vastly inferior to the life that we live now, where you can expect a good solid 60, 70, 80 years of healthy life. How do we balance those things, or do we balance? I mean, how should we regard, I guess, life extending technologies? If we want also to affirm the necessity of death and of understanding death as a limit.
So this is roaming a little bit beyond Seneca, but bioethicists typically draw a distinction between healing and restoration of a body that is under threat in some way, either from maiming or accident or disease on the one hand, and enhancement on the other. So I'll get to a complicated case, but a clear case, which I think is not in tension with the kind of Seneca way of dealing with death, is cancer treatment, because you mentioned it. So cancer treatment is not, it's obviously treatment. It fundamentally is not any different from what physicians have been doing since the advent of the profession. So, if, to the ancient world in Seneca's time, excising surgically some part of the body that was gangrenous or whatever was not unheard of. So that, in a way, the chemical treatment through chemotherapy of cells that have become, sort of taken on a monstrous life of their own to the point that they're killing the person, the patient, is analogous. It's not some leap. Whereas enhancement, I would argue, are treatments like, for example, in UCLA, they just studied last year. It was published. It had 9 subjects, so keep that in mind. But nevertheless, that if you that a cocktail of 3 common drugs, human growth hormone, diabetes medication, and something else combined, somehow seem to kind of slow down the process of aging in human cells. That, I think, is enhancement beyond. So it's a body that's not facing any kind of external harm or disease or what have you, but just in its normal state, in an attempt to make it live longer. So I think the enhancement versus treatment definition or dichotomy can be useful, as that we should embrace the one and be wary of the latter. The complicated case where so I gave a talk about this chapter, and a very smart student pointed this to me. That's a little bit complicated. Is vaccination, right? Is vaccination enhancement, or is it treatment?
Right.
And I don't have a straightforwardly easy answer, but I think again with vaccination, you see that there's a threat coming to human groups in general, and you're mobilizing their own cells to be prepared to fight it. So I think you can put it under the bucket of treatment ultimately, and not as an enhancement. But there are these kind of complicated cases. Cancer isn't one. I think cancer is just, if in Seneca's age they knew, how to treat cancer, it would not be so alien to them, the idea of chemotherapy, if they understood the science. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, there is this complicated question, because as you say, you can point out edge cases in every complicated moral question. Doesn't make the distinction unhelpful, and in fact, that distinction that you make, right, is certainly a valid one. We can see the validity of it just on its face. There is this kind of complicated question, I think, and we have addressed this before, of looking back at pagan philosophy, especially Stoicism, which is so amenable to Christian theology on so many levels, and even finds its way into the New Testament at a number of points. The idea that death is natural to us, combined with the idea that death is unnatural to us. One of those is a pagan idea, right? It's perfectly, it's perfectly pagan to say that death is natural to us, that it sets these natural limits. It's not pagan in most cases to say that death is unnatural, in the sense that it's an imposition of sin upon the world. Is there tension for you in those two ideas? Do you think the Christian idea of resurrection and sin complicates this pagan philosophy at all?
So let me just briefly mention, because you said that Stoicism makes its way into the New Testament. It does so literally in the book of Acts.
That's right.
Because Seneca's brother Gallio is the Roman consul in Achaia when St. Paul is brought forth as a kind of prisoner to have him condemned by Roman authorities, and he declines to do so because he says, "Look, I have no idea what this stuff is about. This is your own, intra-Jewish thing. Don't bother me with it." So that's Seneca's brother, and I love that. That to me is this sort of encounter between Jewish revelation and Greco-Roman thought in a kind of literal, embodied way. Setting that aside, no, of course, there's a tension. I mean, I'm not a Roman pagan, and Seneca's view of death ultimately as something natural does run contrary to the Christian teaching that death is something that's introduced into the world by our first ancestors' sin. Nevertheless, I think the way to reconcile them without saying that they are the same view, which obviously they aren't, is to say that both, I think, would agree that it is what it is, to put it in one of our favorite cliches of our times. It is what it is, in a sense that death is now with us, whether it's a natural process or a product of sin that's kind of distorting life. We now face it. And in both cases, I think there is this sense that precisely its existence lends a kind of urgency for us to live well in the here and now. For the Christian, would be that you have faith, you practice the virtues, including the natural virtues, which to Seneca wouldn't at all be alien. You follow the commandments, blah blah blah, and you seek the sort of true reckoning with God in the next life, not in this life. Now Seneca would say, well, you just die and it doesn't mean anything. But nevertheless, both would accept death as this limit built into life for different reasons, either because it's just the nature of life to end at some point and just dissolve, or because an original transgression introduce this vulnerability into human life. Either one would, I think, reject these kinds of efforts, like I said, to either biotechnologically enhance life or to live so fearfully as we do now, right? So again, I mentioned it was, Seneca didn't say that you should live like a jackass and just embrace every risk and go motorcycling or bungee jumping without a helmet or whatever. He said precisely because death is so present in life, anything could get you. You're very careful about driving, and then you choke on a peach, whatever, nut or whatever,
Right.
and that could kill you too. So you might as well, not live in excessive fear of it, and just be reasonable, right? So yes, like we could just never interact again in person, as some public health authorities fantasize about. By the same token, we could just make the speed limit everywhere 5 miles an hour. That's not healthy. That's it's not reasonable. It's an insane way to go about life, and I think that would resonate with the Seneca. If he knew about the germ theory of disease, he would take what measures the physicians and health authorities recommend, but not to the point where you say, well, I'm just going to put all of life on pause forever. And even if the vaccines work, we should just wear the mask and socially distance forever, because the flu was pretty bad.
I know, it's amazing that we are up against that form of logic. We've really crashed headlong in the coronavirus against the reality of this philosophical question. Maybe 90% of the time, these are abstractions that we talk about. Well, how should we regard death? And then suddenly the pandemic hits, and we realize that there actually are really concrete questions about how we're going to manage risk that depend entirely on just how afraid we are of death. You're making, incidentally, an excellent advertisement for the Memento Mori Twitter account, which just tweets out "you will die someday" randomly at various intervals, and then reminds you, I guess, of the reality of death. All of that having been said, in the time that remains to us, I have one other question, just as a practical matter of personal discipline. I talk all the time on the show about how philosophy needs to be practical. I think your book is oriented in this way, that it's about real questions that will have a direct effect on your life, how you manage coronavirus lockdowns, so forth. And death is a great example of something that it's very easy to philosophize about, and it's easy to say things about, and then you come up against it and suddenly, your world is shattered. I think you and I were chatting off mic before we started recording about this Tim Keller article in The Atlantic, in which he sort of describes his own encounter with imminent death and the challenges that it poses to his theology and philosophy. Did you think about this question writing this chapter, and as a practical matter and as a personal discipline, are there ways that you think this kind of thing can be more than just talk, can be integrated into daily life?
Yes, I did think about it, because when I was writing this chapter was at the height of the lockdowns and the height of the early on in the sort of novel coronavirus pandemic, and at that time, we didn't know as much about the disease. So I think for a couple of weeks at least, and ironically, it happened to be the couple of weeks when I was writing the chapter on Seneca and death. You did have the fear. You went out and you went grocery shopping, and you touched the credit card button thing, and you're like, oh my, I gotta sanitize my hand.
Oh yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
At that moment, it was particularly resonant for me, where I felt like I was writing in the midst of death, and the kind of numbers kept climbing, and so I did begin this practice, I think, of at least every once in a while thinking about the possibility of my own death. I have this really good friend, Rusty Reno, editor of First Things, and he's been a critic of some of the sort of excessive measures in response to the coronavirus. And he always said, it's partly because the people we're dealing with, the kind of secular technocratic types, have neither. And he put this just as I was reading Seneca. So there's this beautiful irony of confluence of life and intellectual work, where he said they have neither the consolations of a Christ nor of a Seneca, and that the practice of thinking about your own death is healthy. It removes, I think you can remove some of the fear, although the moment when it comes, right now I'm perfectly able-bodied and healthy and exercising and eating well. But it's a different question when you're actually facing the misery of end of life care and so forth. But some of the fear, I do believe you can address, you can prepare yourself for by following Seneca's advice. I know if you have faith, there's even another dimension to it. But just as a kind of natural contemplation, I think it's a useful exercise. We could talk about briefly about Seneca's own death. Nero condemned him in the year 65 to being executed because he suspected him of having been a participant in the Pisonian conspiracy. In fact, he wasn't. It was only because one of the participants, the poet Lucan, was Seneca's nephew, and so just by implication, and Nero just kind of wanted to get rid of Seneca, so he gave him the choice, which was typical of either commit suicide or be executed, and obviously he would choose to commit suicide. As it happened, it was a much more kind of painfully drawn out process than you would think, having read his work on death. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was very thin at that point. He was a fairly old man, and Tacitus tells us that his aged frame was kind of attenuated by frugal diet, and so he started sort of slashing at his sinews and his knees and his wrist, and he just wouldn't bleed. So he would inflict pain on himself, but it wouldn't have the desired effect. He took poison, and that didn't work. But finally, he went to a hot bath, and so the combination of self-cutting and the hot bath eventually put him out of his misery. But I do think about that episode ever since having written the book all the time of how to.
It's an agonizing story and very poignant, but it did, if nothing else, offered him the opportunity to demonstrate the courage of his conviction. So it's, as you say, it's not as if people don't do these sorts of things. That is, it's not as if there's no such thing as a story of a man facing nobly against death with calm and composure. So at the very least, we can, spend time attempting to move by half steps in that direction. Sorab, it's been a joy talking to you. Thank you for joining us. The book, one more time for folks, is called The Unbroken Thread, and it can be bought wherever you get books, really, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I would imagine. And thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Spencer.
Hey, so one thing Sorab and I both know a fair bit about is internet censorship. I mean, over at the New York Post, where Sorab runs the opinion page, they were the object of intense persecution, just zapped off of Twitter for breaking a story about Hunter Biden. I've experienced it in my own way on Twitter, building up this community with you guys, building up this relationship through this show, talking about the great ideas and works of the West. But then they just, they can delete you off of these accounts, and they do. I've watched my reach go down, especially this year. And if they zapped us off the internet, how would we know where to find each other, right? I mean, we would genuinely have no idea except through Locals, right? On Locals, which is a platform run by my pal Dave Rubin, it's devoted to free speech. I created the Young Heretics community, which is where we can delve deeper into all this stuff. You can support the show. And if you become a Young Heretics VIP, then you get all sorts of extra stuff. You get episodes a week in advance without ads. You get live Q&As. I write articles you can only find on there. I'm doing workout tips now. I'm doing cigar and whiskey recommendations, a bunch of stuff. If you go to youngheretics.com/locals, you become a VIP. And today, for the first time, I'm really excited to announce this new way that you can become a VIP. I think it's the best way, and that's the annual subscription. So the monthly subscription is $7 a month, but if you sign up for a whole year, you get it for just $56, which is 4 free months. That's 4 free months if you do the annual subscription, youngheretics.com/locals, become a VIP, join the community. I will see you on the other side. Well, I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you did too. It was great to get to hear a little bit more from Sorab. One more time, his book is called The Unbroken Thread, and it is now available, so you should go and check it out. I highly recommend it. I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to Sorab about it. I'd like to talk a little bit more now about these issues that we started to get into in that conversation about the end of life and euthanasia. Now, Sorab is informed, as he said here, by Catholic teaching, as well as by moral reasoning inspired by the ancients like Seneca and so forth. But I thought it was really honest of him to cite that student's question about vaccination as a kind of trouble point on this cut and dry rule that you want to draw between extending life versus staving off unnatural things, right? The idea that death is natural to us as fallen creatures, I think, is sound, and some sense that we are not in the business of prolonging life indefinitely is entirely salutary. I think Sorab's reminding us of something really important there, building off of Seneca, but also off of Catholic teaching and so forth. These things are always, in my view, they are always grayer than the hard and fast rules we draw, both in law and in a religious dogma. We always come up against, in the reality of the moment, you do not know what the right thing is going to be. This is the Aristotelian virtue of what you would call phronesis, practical wisdom, putting your abstract belief into practice in one of the infinitely variable situations. It is not my place, really, I don't think, to interject the rude tools of philosophy into that dark moment where love alone must navigate, which is, this terrible situation, your loved ones, hooked up to life support or whatever. I don't think that you can or should go about making these broad generalizations. And I'm not saying that Sorab was doing this at all. In fact, I think he was very sophisticated about it. But I am just cautioning myself as I go now into addressing this issue of euthanasia and of end-of-life care in more depth. There's a wonderful essay by someone we've read before on this show named Wendell Berry, who was a writer in the 60s in Kentucky and after the 60s as well. And the essay is called Quantity versus Form, and it's about how we should evaluate a human life. I can't remember if I've ever cited before on the show the story from Herodotus in which Solon, the great sage, says to the king of Lydia, to Croesus, the whole shape of a human life is how we evaluate it. And this is part of this idea, right, that you can't evaluate a life except as a complete thing. And the completion of it includes its ending. And Barry is writing about this from a very personal perspective. He says at the opening of this essay, "My family and I had a good friend I will call Lily. Lily was industrious and generous, a good neighbor. She was especially well loved by her neighbors' children and grandchildren, though she had no children of her own. She lived a long time, surviving her husband by many years. At last, permanently ill and debilitated, she had to leave the small house that she and her husband had bought in their latter years and go to the nursing home. My brother, who was her lawyer, never until then much needed, arranged for the sale of her house and all her worldly goods." So here's a woman essentially at the end of her life. "I went to visit her a day or two after the sale. She was bedfast, sick, and in some pain, but perfectly clear in her mind. We talked of the past and of several of our old neighbors long gone, and then, speaking of the sale of her possessions, she said, 'I am all finished now. Everything is done.' She said this so cheerfully that I asked her, 'Lily, is it a load off your mind?' She said, 'Well, Wendell, it hurt me. I laid here the night when I knew it was all gone, and I could see it, all the things I'd cared for so long. But yes, it is a load off my mind.' I was so moved and impressed by what she said that I wrote it down. She had lived her life and met her hardships bravely and cheerfully, and now she faced her death fully aware and responsible, and with what seemed to me a completed grace. I didn't then, and I don't now, see how she could have been more admirable. The last time I saw Lily, she was in the hospital, where the inevitable course of her illness had taken her. By then, in addition to a seriously afflicted heart, she had not recovered from a bout of pneumonia, and because of osteoporosis, she had several broken bones. She was as ill probably as a living creature can be, and in great pain. She was dying. But in talking with the resident physician, I discovered that he had taken her off her pain medication to increase her appetite in the hope, he said, of getting her back on her feet. And so a life in every sense complete had to suffer at its end this addendum of useless and meaningless pain. I don't think this episode is unusual or anomalous at the present time. The doctor's stupidity and cowardice are in fact much mitigated by being perfectly conventional. The medical industry now instructs us all that longevity is a good in itself. Plain facts and simple mercy, moreover, are readily obscured by the supposed altruism of the intent to heal. I am obliged now to say that I am by no means an advocate of euthanasia or assisted suicide. My purpose here is only to notice that the ideal of a whole or a completed life, as expressed in Psalm 128 or in Tiresias' foretelling of the death of Odysseus, now appears to have been replaced by the ideal merely of a long life, and I do not believe that these two ideals can be reconciled. This is what Sorab is talking about, right? This is the complexity here. And again, it is not my place here to insert myself into every case in which these issues come up, right? I mean, there are some laws that we have to make. I mean, I think it would be a good law to say that, intervening to end a life that would otherwise continue naturally is probably bad, right? Especially if the reason for intervention is just because of depression or discomfort. I mean, there are true Orwellian horrors that await on that side of things. And yet, and he goes on in this essay to sort of contemplate the fact that a life can be complete without being very long. And that has to do with you have to have a sense of your purpose, of what you are and what you are for. And if, in fact, you can feel that purpose has been accomplished, has been achieved, then it's actually probably not, I don't think, advisable to just extend life for the sake of extending it, no matter how miserable or unpleasant. And this is one of the things that has most horrified me about coronavirus lockdowns is like people think that they're protecting their lives by staying indoors, and they live, in some accounts, just really, crushed, miserable lives. It's like, is it even living at that point? And I'm not saying that those people should take their own lives. I'm saying they should reevaluate what it means to live and ask whether it's worth it. Even if there is a virus out, even if you are worried about getting it, right? Is it really worth it to make the life that you are living just something that you are living, just something that's happening to you? And one of the things that death does, and acknowledging death as a reality, is it insists for us, it makes us insist that not every kind of life can really deserve the name, and that the quality of life and the purpose of life are essential to understanding what we're here for. I hope you've enjoyed thinking through some of these issues, these sort of delicate issues with me and with Sorab. One last time, go out and check out his book. It's called The Unbroken Thread. Let's do the mailbag. Hey, speaking of the passage of time, I wanted to let you guys know there are only 2 more weeks to get 10% off all your Young Heretics merch. If you go to youngheretics.com/shop and you use the offer code LAUNCH, you can get 10% off, because we're so excited that we've launched this new shop, but it's only 2 weeks left to get this discount. We have all kinds of cool stuff that we've been testing out for a long time. Premium quality shirts. We have a We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirt. There's an awesome hat and stickers that you can use to piss off your leftist professors if you put them on your laptop. All of this stuff is at youngheretics.com/shop. You have 2 more weeks to use the offer code LAUNCH to get 10% off. I love seeing those of you who have already got this stuff. You've tweeted out selfies of yourself wearing it. You look great, let me say. And when you go and get yours now, tweet out your own selfie and I will retweet, because it's so cool to see. youngheretics.com/shop. 2 more weeks to get a discount of 10% with the offer code LAUNCH. Okay, so mailbag questions come to me on locals. Here's one from Zach. Hey Spencer, you've talked on the show before about some of the benefits of learning different languages. How has learning different languages specifically changed the way in which you see the world? Thank you. Yeah, so this is great. I love talking about languages. I love advocating that people learn at least one other language, especially the ancient languages. And the reason for that is that a language is not just like a set of words that you could use instead of the words that we use, right? It's not just like, oh, well, we have the word cow and the French have la vache, like it's much, much deeper than that, because the words that you have available to you, the concepts that the words provide, right, shape the way that you see the world. And I've talked before, for example, about how Hebrew blew my mind open, because all of the languages I had learned before that have basically the same way of thinking about time. Either something happened in the past and it's over, or it's going to happen in the future, or it's happening now, right? These sort of like this tripartite relational idea about time in relation to where the speaker is. In Hebrew, that's less true. It's not that they don't have an idea of past, present, and future, but the verbs themselves have encoded much more into them just a sense of, well, is it complete? Is this action total? Much like we talked about on this show, right? Is this life complete? Or is it kind of ongoing, still in progress? is it continual? And those things aren't necessarily as rooted in time as they have to be sometimes in English. And so, Bereshit bara Elohim, that creation is a total act. God creates the world. In the beginning, God created the world. But also that creation, that complete creation, is still always happening in every moment. So it's very profound. And then, and this is another way that things really, changed for me in learning these languages, right? The gospel, which is in Greek, and the New Testament, which basically uses that definite sense of time that I talked about. It's like an incarnation. It's like taking that kind of bigger Hebrew view of eternity and time and making it, concrete. In this moment, this happened. Jesus went here and did this. And that's the whole point, right? Jesus is in time and space, the reality that God is far beyond time and space. So these different ways of thinking about infinite realities are encoded into different languages, and they can shape your mind to see things you didn't see before in a somewhat perhaps more pedestrian way, although maybe not. I really vividly remember I had a friend in high school who spoke only very little English, and mostly French was his native language. And for the first few months of our relationship, we spoke only in English because he was trying to perfect his English. And then we finally allowed ourselves to speak in French. And I know this is silly, but it was suddenly like, oh, like you don't actually talk the way that you talk in English, right? Like he was very halting in his English, and he had to search for words, and we can only talk about rudimentary things. And it was like, oh, but in French, of course you're fluent in French, right? Like, of course you, and if anything, I'm the kind of halting person who has to speak by half measures. But it was like our relationship, he had been blurred for me, like his face had been blurred, and now it came into living color because I was hearing him express himself in the concepts that were native to him. And the things, I've talked about English this way, right? The things that you own in your heart because you were raised that way. It's like now I hear from him the essence of who he is. This is what language does for us. It's how we communicate to one another, how we record ourselves in time still. At the beginning of this episode, I was reading Seneca. It's like, wow, this person is just here, right? And it's because of his words. It's because a good translator has taken his words and given us some analogs for them in English that get at the sense of what he meant, not just word by word, but concept by concept and idea by idea. And so understanding people in those terms, and it's been called a sort of a face-to-face encounter in the language, the original language of the person who's speaking, is just invaluable. I mean, it really does, I think, create connections where there would otherwise have been none. Thanks for that question. I hope you do go away and learn new languages. And I hope you also check out the Claremont Institute, where I work. They are a great think tank for recovering the American ideals. We publish the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate and let them know in the comments you heard about us through Young Heretics. Thanks for joining me. As always, I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.